When COVID-19 struck in early 2020, governments and institutions, including the Philippines, struggled to contain and handle what would eventually become a massive health crisis.
Inanunsyo ni Pangulong
The
Duterte
Philippine
na
government
ipatutupad ang
implemented selective
enhanced community
quarantine as its
quarantine.
first policy choice to combat the pandemic through Proclamation 922 on March 8, 2020.
Land, domestic air, and domestic sea travel to and from Metro Manila shall be suspended beginning 2020, March, March 15, 2020.
Almost 2 years since then, numerous measures connected to COVID-19 have been created, including policies on healthcare, education, and agriculture. So the question is, what exactly is the role and importance of science in policy making? And how does it affect policymakers in times of great crisis, such as the one we are currently facing? Let's first define the key terms. A policy is a plan, course of action, or set of regulations adopted by the government, businesses, or other institutions designed to influence and determine decisions or procedures. It can also be a law, procedures, administrative actions, incentives, and voluntary practices of governments and other institutions. Policymakers are people who formulate and amend the policies. In the Philippines, particularly when talking about the formulation and amendment of laws, these people may include politicians who draft ordinances, legislate, sign, or veto proposed laws. There are also instances when policymaking involves people in government agencies. Policymaking is the process to formulate and amend policies, which may include the following stages. However, according to Point Park University Online, policymaking processes or cycles are not very linear. The National Coordinating Center for Public Engagement recommends this only to serve as a guide on when S&P researchers, for instance, can input evidence into the policymaking process, as these are some of the natural entry points. The National Research Council identifies 5 science tasks related to policy. Number 1, identifying problems. Number 2, measuring their magnitude and seriousness. Number 3, reviewing alternative policy interventions. Number 4, systematically assessing likely consequences of policy actions. And number 5, evaluating policy results. How do these steps work? Well, these tasks allow the policymakers to understand exactly how things work so that they can make educated and sensible decisions. These are crucial in designing sound policies that benefit the general public. But these do not always mean that science and policy arrive at the same point. More often than not, there is a gap between science and policy. This is the so-called science policy gap, which pertains to the indecision and scientific uncertainty in policy making. In an ideal scenario, evidence-based policy making happens. Scientists produce evidence that policymakers use for decisions, while policymakers provide scientists with the resources they need for research. But problems arise due to the conflicting views between the two. They have different goals, attitudes towards information, views on production, use of evidence, and come from different backgrounds. The academe for the scientists, and the bureaucratic organizations for the policymakers. Scientists prioritize technical strengths, while policymakers focus on the social acceptability and financial feasibility of proposed policies. How then do we close the gap between these two? Safford and Brown highlighted 6 techniques to effectively explain research to policymakers. The first is to know your audience. Scientists need to know their due diligence and find partners, not necessarily in the government, who share the same cause and can get the message across to key figures and affect the conversation. Second is to make clear, actionable suggestions. Clarity helps justify the proposals by outlining benefits and drawbacks to the ideas presented, and ultimately guide audiences on how to act. Third is to repackage your work. Messages should be brief and simple. Findings should be synthesized and repackaged to reach a wider audience. Fourth is to write well. Being concise and straightforward is more important than some fancy writing style. Disseminating copies of the findings can also help further widen the reach of the research by allowing audiences to comment on it and share it with their peers. Fifth is to pick your moment. Scientists need to choose the right time to enhance the likelihood of their success. Checking electoral and legislative calendars can go a long way in getting policies prioritized and implemented. Last is to sustain and amplify your engagement. Experts need to find a support system by joining forces with individuals and organizations interested in the same causes or issues to support their collective case. Communicating with the right people is important, since a strong pitch at the right time helps engage a larger audience, makes information available when needed, and demonstrate the impact of the policy can make on the issue at hand. Science can help policymakers achieve their goals, overcome obstacles, and better manage resources to improve existing laws and policies. But at the end of the day, scientists alone cannot push their research and studies to policymakers without fellow advocates and supporters. It is our collective responsibility to influence our local policymakers and echo their messages to the community. It is only through our collaborative effort that we can achieve change and bridge scientific facts and policy making.